I'm Raegan. I am the head of public policy for Mozilla in the EU. I work in Brussels. So one of our major priorities in Brussels for the past few years has been the Commission's proposal for a copyright directive. After many, many years, this is the opportunity of a generation to bring copyright law in line with the digital age, which is totally in line with the ambitions of the digital single market. We're totally on board. Lots of low-hanging fruit. You know, the copyright framework is super old, basically predates digital, so we wanted to do that. But when I was thinking about what to say today, I kept hitting a wall. Because when you work on copyright, particularly in Brussels, but I think it's probably the same everywhere, it's so difficult to get even really, which seem to be very basic, common sense progressive reforms. As soon as the word, harmonization of exceptions or flexibility comes up, you are met with very aggressive pushback, sometimes from lobbyists, sometimes even from policymakers themselves. And you get kind of in a slump. And you think that this is how it's supposed to be, right? Like it's fine. But it's not fine. It's 100% not fine, because we need copyright reform. The copyright framework that we have in Europe is from 2001. It was passed when we were using these things, VHS. It predates the smartphone. And there was a whole range of different reforms that we need to do that are completely in line with what we thought were the ambitions of the digital single market, to ensure that information, that knowledge, that culture can flow in the single market of Europe, just like the internet allows. And Mozilla cares deeply about copyright. We like to make open source software, and we're actually concerned that what has been proposed by the European Commission could have a very damaging impact on the open source community. But copyright also has a really big importance for all sorts of things that we do online. The way that we access information, how we contribute to culture, how we share it, how we access and share knowledge online. So we need copyright reform. And let's just take a quick look at what exactly I'm talking about, in case you don't have the pleasure of working intensely on the copyright directive. Article 13, use of protected content by ISPs storing and giving access to large amounts of works. There are 4 major problems with Article 13. And there's a recital 38 that's also very confusing, sometimes contradictory. But here is what it actually says. Number 1, it removes the liability protections for intermediaries. So it would essentially make all open platforms liable for the actions of their users. We know that this is a really bad idea, because when you incentivize platforms to take content down, because they will risk intense legal liability, they will take content down. So this has a really damaging effect on freedom of expression. The second thing Article 13 wants to do is to oblige agreements by way of, we're guessing, licenses between these ISPs and rights holders. This is enforcing one type of business model. The third thing that it would be asking is, in order to uphold these agreements that will be negotiated, you have to make sure that no unauthorized content finds its way on your open platform. So you need to craft tailored filtering technology, content recognition software, to make sure that no unauthorized content gets on your platform. And the fourth thing, there's no safeguards. So in the proposal, I think the word safeguards is there, but it doesn't actually say that there should be safeguards like counter notice systems, or that there should be some kind of recognition of exceptions. But it doesn't even matter if there are safeguards, because if you have filters on absolutely everything that you upload, which, by the way, everything is technically copyrighted, then it doesn't really account. The machine never accounts for these types of exceptions. And this isn't just about audio-visual. This isn't about music and movies. This is about all types of copyright. And it's not just about YouTube. It's about all types of platforms. So this is really bad. And so that's why I'm feeling sometimes like the dog in that cafe on fire. And so my academic background is from history. And particularly in my line of work, whenever I'm feeling like I'm hitting a wall or I'm definitely going to lose if I'm up against really deep-pocketed adversaries, I usually look back in the past to try to draw some inspiration, to find if there are lessons to be learned, if there are mistakes that we should not repeat, and if there are patterns that we can find. And what I want to say to you today is that I have looked in the past for copyright. And I want to tell you that we have been here before. We have been here before. And we have conquered what seemed to be the impossible. We have triumphed. And I think we can do it again. And when I say we, what exactly do I mean? I mean Mozilla, the open source community. But I also mean educators, civil liberties defenders, startups, tinkerers, coders, researchers, academics, any person who appreciates the basic liberties that we have on the internet to freely access and share information and knowledge online. And perhaps this is also a good time to give a disclaimer that Mozilla is not anti-rights holder. We are not anti-entertainment industry. We are not anti-copyright. But Mozilla is anti-bad policy. And that's what we have in the copyright directive right now. Mozilla is a rights holder. Actually, we consider ourselves to be rights holders. We do have some exclusive rights, like trademarks. Of course, also we champion open licensing. We build open source software. But also, I'm a rights holder. And so are you, and you, and you. And every single person in this room, and every single person on this planet is also a rights holder. So that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the massive corporations, the record labels, those big rights holders that claim to represent creators, artists, composers. And so I went back into history and noticed a pattern. There's a very typical pattern of behavior for major rights holders, like the entertainment industry. They hold on to control, sometimes so much control that it borders the absurd. They resist change, normally technological change, but also change in consumption patterns for consumers, change when there's new market players, when they are starting to lose 100% of market control and distribution. And establish a catchy narrative. This is also very important. You have to establish catchy terms and phrases, and you have to own that narrative. And that becomes very compelling. But what I also saw is that this pattern of behavior also sparks a kind of cycle. And the cycle is that these major rights holders go so far in trying to control everything. They go so far in trying to resist technological change, which is essentially futile. And eventually their narrative crumbles, and it pushes policymakers to actually balance the interests and to wake up and say, no, we will devise copyright law, or we will say no to this law because we want to benefit the all and not just the privileged few. So here's the first example. I say to you that the blank is to the American film producer and the American public as the Boston Strangler is to the woman home alone. So pop quiz. Which technology do you think that this person is referring to? Anyone? We have a lot of copyright experts, a high concentration of copyright experts at CopyCamp. So there's bonus questions. Does anyone know who said this? Jeremy Zifrin, of course, he's in the front row. And which year was this? So this was Jack Valenti, the former head of the Motion Picture Association of America. It was in 1982. He was addressing the US Congress, and he was talking about the VCR. Now, it's a really good thing that Congress didn't actually listen to his pleas that this would be such a danger. Because as we know, the VCR and later on the DVD became an incredibly lucrative way for the film industry to actually reach more audiences and to distribute content. So this was actually a good thing. So let's move up about another decade or so into Europe. So we have the InfoSoc directive. This is the current copyright directive that we have that was passed in 2001. In this directive, there is one mandatory exception in the EU, Article 5.1. Does anyone know what that exception is? Temporary acts of reproduction, particularly if it is for the purposes of a transmission of network between third parties by an intermediary. So basically, that it's okay to surf the internet and that we don't have to have licenses. ISPs don't have to pay licenses to rights holders in order to make a temporary copy when the content is in the network very briefly between point A to point B. This seems kind of basic, right? That it should be fine to surf the web without having to pay royalties because it probably isn't a source of revenue for, it's very innocuous. It seems basic. But it wasn't basic. Actually, it was a huge battle to get that exception in there. And there were lots of major rights holders like the European Publishing Council who called this exception, that said it would be a gaping hole in rights holders' protection under the reproduction right, that it would be an unacceptable threat to rights holders. But what happened when it passed? Nothing. There was no interruption with profits. The definition was completely fine. The safeguards were completely fine. So in hindsight, it makes you really question the credibility of what those major rights holders are lobbying for, because that's a bit absurd. And thankfully, the Commission and the EU decided to add that exception. Not so lucky in Canada, my home country, which actually Canadian legislators failed to add this exception for essentially caching, for surfing the web. And you had rights holders that were demanding ISPs for royalties for them doing their jobs, connecting people to information. And this actually was happening at a critical time of broadband rollout, and it created this dark legal cloud of uncertainty for all of these ISPs. And it wasn't until 2004 that the High Court of Canada actually struck it down. And again, looking in hindsight, maybe this example was what has helped to bring Canada into sometimes a more progressive perspective on copyright areas, like notice and notice, for instance. Like the last copyright reform they did, they expanded fair dealing to include user-generated content. Who knows? Maybe it was listening to these rights holders and seeing how crazy it was. And so here's my third example, the anti-counterfeiting trade agreement. This was a trade agreement with a bunch of governments, really, really backed up by major entertainment industry that wanted to create a gold standard for enforcement of intellectual property. One of the major examples of this was the counterfeiting of medicines, mass producing fake medicines, selling them to unbeknownst populations. That's bad, right? But of course, we should also throw in copyright infringements online there, because that's also bad too. And so what was really heartening, actually, about the ACTA movement was that it really struck a chord with people. And in Europe, people kind of just came out of the woodwork and went into the streets to push back against this draconian online enforcement, which had no balance and was too far and would have threatened a lot of the freedom of expression, privacy, the openness of the internet, you name it. But it's another great example of owning this narrative. So the narrative that the major rights holders used at this time, and this is a classic, you've probably heard it, the internet is killing the entertainment industry. Because of the internet, consumers don't want to pay for content anymore. They're done. They're all pirates. Because of the internet, they want to download their music, they want to download their movies, and thus the entertainment industry is dying. And that's why we need ACTA. That's why we need draconian enforcement. That's why we need to be able to take down content. That's why we have to force ISPs to be liable, because our industry is dying. And was it? What do you guys think? No. No, not at all. And actually, not only was the entertainment industry not dying because of the internet, but it was thriving because of it. And so there's a ton of studies and movements and campaigns that happened during this time, but one of them in particular is Mike Masnick's The Sky is Rising. He just wrote this report that completely eviscerated every single claim that false claim that the entertainment industry was propagating. And it basically found that in all areas, music, movies, film, games, more profits every single year. That people were spending more and more money each year on content, and that there were even more jobs in the creative industries. So they were actually thriving, not dying. And so here we are, a new time, a few years in advance, a new era, but like a really familiar pattern of behavior, very familiar pattern of behavior. We have the resistance to change, to changing consumption patterns, new market players, new business models. We have the need for control, to license the internet again, to force platforms to become liable for all sorts of protected content. And of course, we have an even more catchy narrative, the value gap, which is the value that apparently the recording industry is losing to streaming platforms through ad revenue like YouTube. But you can't really compare old, so these rights holders are saying, again, that Article 13 is what they need to survive. They're trying to intensely, actually not trying, they're being quite successful. They're intensely lobbying the EU at this critical negotiation period in this directive to say that Article 13 is what Europe needs to protect artists, to protect creators, because their business is dying. And I can see how this value gap narrative can be really compelling, especially in an age where you have more and more tech companies becoming bigger and bigger, and our online space is becoming more and more converged. So I understand that, but the value gap is a fiction. The entertainment industry continues to see growth and record-breaking profits. And you can't compare physical CD sales from the 1990s to, say, ad-supported revenues from streaming or subscriptions to massive music libraries. It's just not the same comparison. So it doesn't actually account for that growth. And it doesn't account for the increased income for the music publishers, the collecting societies, and the record labels in this transition. And so each decade, it seems that there's inertia from major rights holders. Then there's momentum, thanks to copy fighters, people fighting constantly and never giving up for progressive copyright reform. And in the end, the major rights holders actually benefit. They come out better from this transition. And I hope, I believe that we are at another cusp of another cycle. I hope that in 6 years, maybe less, we'll be at a CopyCamp and looking back and laughing at that time in Europe where we almost let the rights holders license the internet. And in a lot of ways, you can't really blame, the major rights holders, the entertainment industry. I mean, it's certainly not the strategy that I would pursue, but if they want to maximize profits, that's how they're doing it. However, you can blame and you can hold accountable the people that you have elected that are making decisions that will impact you and your family and everyone and how you use the internet and how you access culture. They are making decisions on your behalf here in your country and also in the EU. So this is our link to a way that you can call your representative, a representative in the European Parliament. There are a ton of different campaigns happening on copyright, on all sorts of different areas, text and data mining, and education, on the filters, on ancillary copyright. And so I would advise you for these next 2 days during CopyCamp is to connect with one another and to share information, to share knowledge, to scheme, to build campaigns, and to build movement. And most of all, do not give up, because we have been here before, and we have triumphed, and we can do it again. Thank you.